Welcome back to these videos I don't make forever. I always want to make these videos, right? But I don't want to be the person that's just like, here's a book review, here's another book review, here's another book review, because I wanted to do some fun stuff, but I don't have time, and I can't think of anything else to do, and I don't want to just be like, oh well, here's another thing I read today. But on that note, here's another thing I read. This was actually a gift for my birthday. I remember I said before I got like a bunch of books for my birthday. This was one of them, along with its sequel. I finished it a while back. I'm a huge fantasy fan, so I want to read all the fantasy stuff, yeah. So I wrote down my opinions on it, and I'm going to share it with you guys. And yes, holding this mic like up to my face is the only way I can get good sound. If I just let it sit on the table, you can barely hear me. Anyway, so forgive my memory because it's been a little while since I've read these, so I don't know if my memory is that fresh. But I tried to do a little research before I made this to try and jog myself. So it'll probably be very basic. But we open up into the world of Damar, which is what the series is named after. And I love that you're immediately thrown into this world and there's like a big emphasis on world building. It's not a typical fantasy setting where it's like medieval Europe or whatever they like to say about fantasy. This feels more like, it reminds me more of like a Wild West setting, but in a fantasy world. Does that make sense? I'll explain more about that in a minute, but there's a lot of magic, a lot of heart, and there's a lot more magic in this one than there is the sequel. And I ended up liking this one less than the sequel. And what's really interesting is we have a female protagonist for this book, and it's sort of like the strong female trope, but I don't want to spend all day on that because I know it's 50-50. You love it or you hate it, whatever. But it's not like these days to where you have a female protagonist and you're kind of annoyed because it's just like their only trait is that they're a girl and they're a hard ass. You know what I'm saying? But not in this case. In this case, our protagonist is Harry, and her being female is quoted as a challenge, but that's about it. It's kind of surprising that in this day and age you have a bunch of girls walking around in the poofy dresses and you have one that wants to use a sword instead. And it's a bit surprising, but they're like, hey, if that's what you want to do. They don't use it as like an automatic excuse as like, okay, well, you're a girl, so I have to give you everything you want, in that sort of way that these common books do nowadays. So her name is Harry, short for Angared, I think. Angared. She prefers Harry, and I don't blame her. So we start with her joining her brother as a ward to like this really healthy, it's very wealthy, upper class home. And it's kind of like a stale war where both sides have soldiers that aren't really active, but they're in the military in case something happens. And her brother is one of those people and they have connections into the military. So you have the colonel and like other people that come to this house. And these people, you can consider them like colonists, sort of. They have the fancy clothes and they have the cigars and they sit around the tables and they talk about the conditions of life, and they place a lot of importance on appearance and etiquette. What is not right for a lady to do and all that. They don't even want their women to even sit in on conversations that involve things like war and all that because women. But Harry is more of an adventurer, a free spirit. She's curious and she wants to listen. She has her own opinions on what they think they should do, right? And for me, the politics are a little hard to follow sometimes because you're just immediately opened up into like this continent that has like different nations, but it's actually divided by directions. So like you have the north and the south, and then they have their own land within those territories. I'm not really sure. I just kept reading. But there is a war on the brink between the north and the south, where we heard this before. But they're divided by like, anyway, Harry sits in on them talking, and they have a conversation whether they think there might be a war, whether or not, over who's competent, over who's not. So the primary conflict of this book involves the dispute between the two nations. The homeland, which is Damar, and the Damar desert, which is the south, I think. So let me try to expand on that a little bit. The homeland, the northern part of the Damar of the Damar nation, sort of taken over by what they call the hill folk. So they have their own customs, they have their own traditions, and in this way, the best way to describe it to me would be like the colonists in the town, and then like Native Americans sort of on the north. They don't have a settlement. They roam wherever they decide to go, and they just kind of settle on the plains. And then we have the southern part, which is the desert, the Damar Desert, and apparently it's very harsh, very bad land, and it's taken over by the Damarians, and those are the more like nomad-like and the warrior-like people. So the Damarians in the desert think that the homeland belongs to them, and that the hill folk shouldn't be there. So there's constant like raids and skirmishes between the two groups. There's also this thing where like all of them see the north as a supernatural phenomenon. They call them demons and whatnot. We don't even see them, but there's this overlooming threat that they're coming. Being in the South, I also share that view. Just joking. So the goal is that they need to unite to protect all of them. And they're like out of the blue, they're visited from this strange man. He's like the leader of the Plains people. And they always have this like affinity for being more attached to the spiritual side of things, and the colonists are more practical. So there's already this tension between the two groups, just in cultural differences. But their leader, Corlath, actually sucked up his pride to come down there and suggest that they make an alliance for when the North attacks. And what's worse is that like he saw this through a premonition, and naturally they think he's nuts. And they turn him down, but it's more of a pride problem, really. They just can't be seen, dealing with these people. They want to do it on their own. We don't need them. But there's this instant connection between him and Harry. They make eye contact. And you know what they say, that if you make eye contact longer than 7 seconds, I'll expand more on that later. Anyway, this isn't exactly spoiler material. It's on the back. It says right here, when Corlath, the Hillfolk King, sees her for the first time, he is shaken. So that's all like the catalyst, the start of the story. He gets this magical feeling, which is part of the magic system that we'll also talk about later, that Harry will be important to their future somehow. So as he's riding away, he legit has this feeling, okay? And this is where he turns around and goes back to kidnap her. So yeah, that's a thing that happens in this book, and everybody's okay with that. This is where I start to have a problem. It's supposed to be a romantic start between the two of them, right? But I don't know exactly how old she's supposed to be here, but they still consider her a child. So let's say like 12 to 15, something like that. So I love how everyone says this book is great, and they don't have a problem with that part specifically. Like this is the only part that sort of flared up red flags for me, because this is a grown man. He's the king of their people. Like I want to say 30s, in his 30s or something like that. Even 20s is still too much. And they always say like way back then you could be 12 or 13 to marry somebody, and I'm like, whoa, Nelly. Okay, even 18 I think is still too young for people to actually be considered mature. Even 21, I still know some 21, 22, 3-year-olds who act like children. I don't know, because I know different time periods had different opinions of that, but this book was published in 1982, so I don't know if that's still acceptable for the time or not, being as I'm not even close to the 80s. And even if it wasn't for the age thing, which you could overlook because of the time period, it's about the kidnapping thing, okay? He literally ties her up. It leaves her draped across his saddle the whole way over there until they arrive back to where they're going. And when they get there, she kind of decides like, oh, well, I guess I'm here now, so I guess that's it. She doesn't try to escape, which I thought she would have tried or anything, but she does acknowledge that they're just way stronger than her, that she shouldn't even try it. But at the same time, that kind of counteracts her personality. So over the course of the story, a lot of the story, I want to say about the middle, the good third of the portion, is her integrating herself with these people. She sort of just becomes part of them. She just accepts her way, that now this is where she's at now, and she meets the people. She gets attached to certain people. She is interested in their ways. She wants to know more about their culture, and they teach her. They have like a training montage, really, where Corlath never explains to her why she's important. It's just that he knows she is. And she learns their way of fighting, such as, the sword skills, riding bareback. And I know it sounds like a lot of nothing is really happening, but I will say that it's actually amazingly written. It's an interesting read to follow along with. And I say I was interested for the first bit, but then it's kind of slowed down for me when all that started to happen, because it didn't seem like a lot was happening at all. But then we got to the part to where after she gets past the training phase and she actually starts applying herself, that it became more fun to read. There's something really enigmatic about the Plains people, and then we get introduced to the magic system. They call it Kalar, and I would classify it as a soft magic system because everybody uses it in their own way. It shows itself in different stages, different strengths, different abilities. So anybody could show signs of Kalar in some way. You never know who could have what. This often manifests itself as a feeling or an instinct of needing to know what they need to do without knowing why. And first, it's important to note that not everybody has it. They don't mention it in this book, I think, but I'm going to go ahead and say that in the sequel, they say that only people of royal blood have the power to use Kalar. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, because later on they say that everybody has it. It's just been more suppressed and more powerful in royalty. So I don't know if that's true or not, because it seems like in this one that a lot more people have it randomly. And we find out that Harry is a non-user. And there's a clear difference between people who can use it and people who can't. They're seen as like better than the rest. I don't know. But it's important because the Kalar that you have basically is a representation of how strong you are on the inside. The stronger you are as a person, the stronger it applies itself when you use it. Like, for instance, Corlath has a unique wind Kalar. It's basically what it sounds like. It grants him control over the wind, the element of it. It lets him control the wind. It lets him, summon certain weather patterns, and also use it for transportation. Honestly, while reading this, I don't recall that much of his power in here. Just that he's known to be very mysterious, very powerful, without actually displaying that. But I do recall mentioning that his power is used to help their people travel across the vast land, and that's how they travel so fast and so good from place to place, is because he uses the wind to help them do that. And let's talk about Harry, okay? When I was doing my research for this book, apparently the name of her Kalar is called blue shifting, and I don't recall that being mentioned in the book unless I'm just an idiot and missed it. But apparently her Kalar is so powerful that the hill folk can recognize it in her, even though she, doesn't manifest it very early on like most people do. It's one of those cases to where a typical coming of age story, everyone else around you is matured and has their power, and you have someone who hasn't displayed it yet, so they think they don't have it and they're an outcast. And then it comes to find out that they're a late bloomer and they're the actual strongest of all. It's one of those kind of stories. And they even give her a nickname, Harry Soul, because it's related to a very common legend that they have, that her power is similar to Lady of the Hill Folk. So they start treating her like royalty. And already she's known to be like a big person. They mention this a lot. She's very tall, very broad. She has like a natural warrior's physique, and her Kalar actually grants her this ability to be more physically strong, faster agility, more endurance. Supposedly it helps her control her weapons better also, which I thought this was just from her training. I don't know. And apparently she can also manipulate fire. I don't recall that either. Have I read half of this book? Because from what I remember, there's mention of Kalar, and it's very suppressed, very subtle, very mysterious. And then you have the conflict of war between the two. Then you have a training montage. Then you have her getting close to Corlath. But she's also close to another guy, this mentor of hers. And you start to question, who is she meant to be with? They make it sound like she's meant to be with Corlath. And then she starts training with this guy. And you're like, is she meant to be with him? But he's an old man. And then all of a sudden, she's with Corlath. And I'm like, what? One of her biggest strengths for her Kalar, though, is that she can create barriers, which do become very useful. There's also another thing with her. It's not a very prominent part of the plot, okay? But for some reason, she's always surrounded by animals. She has a connection with Corlath's warhorse, for instance. But in the second book, it's kind of explained. Not explained, but you see why. I don't think this is really a necessary part of the story, but for some reason they add in that she's always being followed by this big cat. It's just like a big hunter cat that's just attached itself to her. So wherever she goes, it goes. And also the horse. It's a very strange thing to just throw in the book like this. And I see more of it in the sequel, which I will get to, but it does the same thing. It's really weird. So let's get to the title, The Blue Sword, right? This is what I love about fantasy books. It's the fantasy weapons. Come on, guys. I love the swords and stuff. I have a whole video planned just for stuff like that. But in this one, the blue sword actually refers to a legendary weapon known as Gaunteran. It's a sapphire blue blade. And it said that it only reveals itself to somebody who's worthy. Well, chosen one, anybody? It's really fun to watch her grow up in this world and just sort of find her place. Because she never felt like she fit in with the wealthy people. She couldn't consider herself growing up and just marrying some rich guy and doing nothing with her life. She was more happy to be active in adventure, fighting. So really the only downsides I had with this book was that sometimes it was a little boring because there was times where she was just sitting around the camp not really doing anything. The randomness of the wild animals that don't add anything to the story. And most importantly, the strange kidnapping aspect between her and her supposed love guy. We know that Corlath is seen as a good guy because that's kind of how he's introduced. You know immediately that he's going to be important to the story when he shows up because everybody else is so stubborn and he's trying to unite them. So we get that impression, sure, but we don't know that. Nobody knows that. And if we didn't know that, this scene would look so bad. This grown man kidnaps a girl, and you have no idea what his intentions are for her, what he plans to do, why he's done it, and she has no way to fight him. And he's got a group of people with him, a group of these other warrior guys, you know? I'm saying she's just so lucky that he turned out to be a good person who just wanted to take her to her fate or whatever. But in real life, I feel like this would not have turned out this way. And I hate to say it that way, that real life has become so jaded to where you can't even believe somebody could be a good person. But at the same time, that's not how life works. You get kidnapped, you rarely come back. I'm a bit confused on the audience for this book also because it's classified technically as a YA novel. And reading that, I didn't get that impression because it's so well written that it felt like an adult novel to me. There's no adult scenes in it, sure. And it's just that the character is young, I think, which classifies it as a YA. On the other book, it has an award on it. A Newbery Honor, this is an award for middle-aged grade books, I think. So I'm like, who is this for? So I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars because it was all right, but it wasn't really amazing. It was a good story, at the same time. I did have some problems with it, which I touched on. And I'm glad. I wasn't really excited to look forward to the sequel, but I was glad when I started it and I realized that it was nothing compared to this one. It's in the same universe, but it's more of a prequel. So I'm going to get on that one and show what I liked and didn't like about it. So that's all I have for today about The Blue Sword. I hope you enjoyed reading this review and my honest opinion of it. I'm sure it's not as entertaining, but I value more to be honest. I'm gonna shelve this and get to the other one. Hope you enjoyed it.